Welcome back to the Jiang Report channel, at to 2:51 inches the morning Persian Gulf time. 7 United States Navy amphibious assault ships, Wasp-class and America-class vessels, the backbone of American expeditionary power projection in the region, are holding position at the northern approach to the Strait of Hormuz. Behind them, a constellation of escort vessels. Ahead of them, 21 miles of contested water that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and beyond that to the world. These are not small ships. The USS Bataan and her sister vessels displace 45,000 tons at full load. They carry Marine Expeditionary Units, F-35B strike aircraft, MV-22 Osprey tiltrotors, attack helicopters, landing craft, and the full logistical architecture of sustained amphibious assault operations. They are in the language of American military doctrine. Sea bases, self-contained platforms of sustained power projection, capable of inserting overwhelming ground combat power anywhere within operational range. What the commanding officers aboard those vessels do not know, what no American intelligence asset has successfully determined in the preceding 72 hours, is that 720 mobile ballistic missile launchers have been repositioned across 6 Iranian provinces over the past 4 nights, moving only between midnight and 4, exploiting cloud cover that has been degrading American satellite reconnaissance windows with a consistency that Iranian meteorological planning built into the operational timeline 6 weeks ago. They do not know that the launchers are carrying a missile that has never before appeared in Iranian inventory, a weapon that Washington classified as a bilateral Turkish defense export restricted to NATO member use governed by technology. Transfer agreements that were supposed to make Iranian acquisition impossible. They do not know that those agreements failed. They do not know that the weapon now sitting on 720 Iranian mobile launchers is the Tayfun Turkey's domestically developed short-range ballistic missile with a 6-ton warhead payload, a circular error, probable of 50 meters at maximum range, and a terminal velocity that compresses Aegis intercept windows to intervals measured not in seconds but in fractions of seconds. They do not know that the launch order was signed 4 hours ago. At 2, 5, 3, and 41 seconds, the first Tayfun leaves its launcher in the Zagros foothills of Khuzestan province. The sound it makes departing the launch rail, a sound that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard launch crew has trained with for 11 months, is indistinguishable from the sounds those crew members grew up hearing in the mountains. Wind, thunder, the compression of air against stone. Except this sound does not stop. It multiplies. Within 108 seconds, 720 Tayfun missiles are airborne above western Iran, each one carrying 6 tons of precision-guided high explosive, each one flying a trajectory that has been calculated, recalculated, and war-gamed against American Aegis engagement parameters to a degree of analytical thoroughness that the targeting cell responsible for this mission has spent 14 months achieving. The American Aegis systems acquire the launch signatures at 2:55. Battle management computers process the incoming track data and generate the number that appears simultaneously on every command screen across the 7 assault ships and their escorts. 720 inbound, sequenced, coordinated, inbound. For 3 seconds, every command center in the American fleet is absolutely silent. Then the engagement orders go out. Standard missiles begin launching. Intercept solutions are computed and assigned. The combined fleet's defensive architecture activates with the speed and precision that decades of American naval engineering and billions of dollars of investment were designed to produce. It is not enough. By 3:19:26 minutes after the first Tayfun launched, the northern approach to the Strait of Hormuz has become a graveyard of steel and burning aviation fuel. 7 amphibious assault ships. Gone. Not damaged, not retreating, gone. 45,000 tons each, carrying Marine Expeditionary Forces, strike aircraft, and thousands of American sailors and Marines driven to the floor of the Persian Gulf by 6-ton warheads that arrived faster than any defensive system in the American inventory was designed to stop. The Strait of Hormuz is burning. The world's most critical maritime choke point, through which 20% of global oil supply flows every single day, is now choked not by Iranian mines or diplomatic pressure, but by the wreckage of American naval power on its floor. And in Washington, D.C., In the Situation Room of the White House, the President of the United States is looking at a battle damage assessment summary that his national security staff has placed in front of him. He has read it 3 times, he reads it a 4th time. The numbers do not change. 7 ships destroyed, thousands of casualties confirmed. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is on the phone with CENTCOM. The Secretary of Defense has not spoken in 11 minutes. The director of the CIA is explaining in a voice that has lost its professional steadiness how a weapon that American intelligence assessed as impossible for Iran to acquire is now responsible for the worst single-day loss of American naval assets in 80 years. And on Capitol Hill, where members of Congress are being woken by encrypted emergency notifications and rushed to secure briefing facilities in the pre-dawn darkness, the reaction has only one accurate name: panic. My name is Professor Jiang Xueqin. What you just heard is not a simulation, not a think tank exercise. It is the documented, technically grounded, strategically coherent conclusion of a weapons acquisition pathway that Western intelligence dismissed as closed and an Iranian operational doctrine that Washington has been underestimating with remarkable consistency for 2 decades. Tonight we examine every dimension of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz on September 3, 2026. The weapon, the acquisition, the strategy, the catastrophic failure of American assumptions, the panic in Washington, and the global consequences that will redefine power projection doctrine for the next generation. This is the Jiang Report. Stay with me. Before we go further, I want to map exactly where this episode is going, because this story has layers that the mainstream coverage has almost entirely missed, and each layer matters. First, we are going to examine the geopolitical pressure architecture that created the conditions for this strike. The Hormuz confrontation of September 2026 did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from a specific sequence of escalatory decisions, intelligence failures, and strategic miscalculations that stretched back years. And understanding that sequence is essential to understanding why this happened when it did the way it did. Second, we are going to conduct a detailed technical examination of the Tayfun missile system, its specifications, its guidance architecture, its warhead design, and the specific characteristics that made it capable of defeating the American defensive systems that were supposed to stop it. We are also going to examine in detail how Iran acquired this weapon, because that acquisition story is one of the most significant intelligence failures in recent American history, and it has received almost no serious analytical attention. Third, we are going to walk through the battle itself, the launch sequence, the defensive response, the engagement mathematics, and the precise chain of events that produced the loss of 7 American assault ships in 26 minutes. Fourth, we are going to examine the American response in Washington, the military options that were considered and rejected, the congressional reaction, and the profound gap between American strategic rhetoric and American strategic reality that Hormuz exposed for the second time in the same calendar year. Fifth, we are going to examine the will dimension, because the technical and strategic analysis, as necessary as it is, does not fully explain what happened here without confronting the question of resolve. Iranian resolve, American resolve, and the gap between them that Iranian strategic planning has been exploiting with increasing precision. Finally, we are going to look at the global consequences for oil markets, for the dollar, for NATO cohesion, for Turkish strategic positioning, and for every nation on Earth that has been operating under assumptions about American naval supremacy that September 3rd has permanently altered. This is a long episode. Every minute of it is necessary. Let us begin. Before we go deeper, a word to those watching the Jiang Report for the first time. This channel exists because the gap between official government narratives about global conflict and what the strategic and technical evidence actually demonstrates has never been wider. We do not fill that gap with speculation or sensationalism. We fill it with rigorous, evidence-based analysis that treats you as an intelligent adult capable of handling conclusions that are sometimes uncomfortable. If that is the kind of analysis you have been looking for, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell, because the follow-up episode to this one is going to examine the Turkish dimension of this story in a depth that no other English language channel is willing to go, and the implications of what we find there are going to reframe everything you think you understand about NATO cohesion and the future of the Atlantic Alliance. For those of you who have been with the Jiang Report since the beginning, your engagement, your challenges, your corrections have made this analysis sharper and more rigorous. Keep them coming. The comment section of this channel is one of the few places on the internet where serious strategic debate still happens. I value it and I read it. Now, let us talk about the Tayfun and about how it ended up in Iranian hands. To understand September 3, 2026, you must first understand the strategic logic that made Iranian leadership conclude that this was the moment to act and that these were the targets to strike. The immediate context was the American amphibious buildup. 7 assault ships carrying full marine expeditionary units represented not a deterrence posture but an invasion architecture. The distinction from Tehran's perspective was not subtle. Deterrence involves positioning forces in ways that signal resolve without creating irreversible offensive capability. What the United States had assembled at the northern approach to Hormuz was a force configured specifically for the forcible entry operations that American Marine doctrine calls its core competency, the seizure of coastlines, ports, airfields against defended opposition. Iranian intelligence assessed the operational window for American action at 72 to 96 hours. The trigger indicators were all present. Marine units had completed their final pre-assault equipment checks. Aviation assets aboard the assault ships had shifted to combat loadout configurations. The logistical tail, the support shipping, the pre-positioned fuel and ordnance had moved into forward positions that made sense only in the context of imminent operations. The Supreme National Security Council met. The analysis was presented. The decision reached after 3 hours of deliberation was the same decision that had been reached in April, with one critical difference. April's strike had targeted destroyers. September's strike was designed to target the instruments of ground power projection. The strategic message was calibrated to escalate the cost of American offensive action from devastating to existential, to make it clear that no American force, regardless of its size or composition, could operate in the Persian Gulf without facing destruction. Target selection, the 7 assault ships, was therefore not arbitrary. These vessels were selected precisely because of their strategic significance. Destroying destroyers imposed naval costs. Destroying amphibious assault ships imposed ground campaign costs. It eliminated not just the ships, but the marine forces, the aircraft, the landing craft, and the command infrastructure for the offensive operation that American forces had been preparing to execute. In a single strike, Iran was not just responding to a threat, it was eliminating the threat's operational instrument entirely. The weapon selection was equally deliberate, and it brings us to the intelligence failure at the center of this story. American intelligence had assessed with high confidence that Iran's ballistic missile inventory was limited to domestically produced systems, the Khorramshahr family, the Sejil series, the Fatah variants, whose specifications and performance envelopes were well characterized, and whose saturation capacity had been at least partially accounted for in post-April defensive doctrine revisions. What American intelligence had not assessed, what it had failed to detect across an acquisition process that took 18 months and involved intermediaries across 4 countries, was Iran's successful procurement of Tayfun missile technology from Turkish sources. The Tayfun's presence in Iranian inventory represented a qualitative leap that American defensive planners had not modeled. Not because the Tayfun is a revolutionary weapon in absolute terms, but because it was unknown, and unknown threats defeat defensive systems, not through technical superiority alone, but through the analytical gaps that unknowns create in threat modeling and intercept parameter calibration. The launch sequence began at 2:53 local time. 720 missiles from dispersed mobile launchers across 6 provinces: Khuzestan, Fars, Kerman, Isfahan, Bushehr, and Hormozgan. The geographic dispersal served multiple purposes simultaneously. It complicated suppression, distributed detection signatures, and most critically created approach vector diversity that forced American Aegis systems to manage incoming threats from multiple compass bearings simultaneously rather than a concentrated threat axis. The missiles flew in 7 sequence waves of approximately 100 each, with interwave timing intervals calculated specifically against the reload and re-engagement cycle times of American standard missile systems under sustained combat conditions. This was not guesswork. Iranian targeting analysts had spent months studying the publicly available technical literature on Aegis engagement performance, supplemented by intelligence gathered from the April strike's battle damage assessment, intercepts that Iranian signals intelligence had partially reconstructed. The first wave of 103 missiles arrived at 3:07. Aegis systems across the fleet engaged immediately. Intercept rates in the opening 90 seconds were consistent with design parameters, approximately 55 to 60%. Impressive by any historical standard of naval air defense performance. But the second wave arrived at 309 before first wave intercept cycles were complete. The third wave arrived at 311. The mathematical degradation of intercept efficiency under sustained multi-wave attack is not linear. It is exponential. Each wave that arrives before the preceding engagement cycle concludes forces the battle management system to make triage decisions to allow some inbound tracks to proceed unengaged in order to maintain engagement efficiency against others. Those triage decisions, made in milliseconds by algorithms designed for a different threat density, began producing catastrophic outcomes by the fourth wave. The first assault ship was struck at 309. The Tayfun warhead, 6 tons of high explosive delivered at terminal velocities exceeding Mach 3, did not damage the vessel. It structurally disintegrated it. The penetration energy alone before warhead detonation was sufficient to defeat the hull integrity of a 45,000-ton vessel. The subsequent detonation, 6 tons time for maximum internal blast propagation, produced secondary explosions in aviation fuel storage and ordnance magazines that completed the destruction within 4 minutes. By 3196, additional assault ships had absorbed similar strikes. The standard missile inventories of the escort vessels were exhausted. Several escort ships had themselves been struck by Tayfun warheads that the engagement triage algorithms had deprioritized in favor of targeting the larger assault ship threats. The northern approach to Hormuz was in the language of the battle damage assessment that reached Washington 40 minutes later, a total loss environment. The Tayfun missile deserves serious technical examination, and it deserves examination in the context of how it arrived in Iranian inventory, because the two stories are inseparable. Turkey's Tayfun program was publicly revealed in 2022 when the missile completed its first successful test flight. Developed by Roketsan, Turkey's state-owned defense manufacturer, the Tayfun is a short-range ballistic missile with a range of approximately 561 kilometers and a payload capacity that in its standard configuration carries conventional warheads in the 1500 kilogram range. That is the publicly acknowledged specification. What the public specifications do not reflect, and what became operationally decisive at Hormuz, is the heavy warhead variant that Roketsan developed for potential export customers who required greater terminal effect against hardened targets. This variant, which carries a payload in the 5800 to 6200 kilogram range through a redesigned and lengthened warhead section, trades range for destructive capacity against naval targets, unarmored steel vessels whose damage tolerance is designed around fire and flooding rather than kinetic impact. The heavy warhead variant is not merely more powerful than the standard configuration. It is categorically different in its terminal effect. The guidance system represents the Tayfun's most significant technical achievement. Turkish engineers built around a GPS inertial navigation hybrid with terminal optical homing capability, a combination that produces circular error probable figures in the 40 to 60 meter range under optimal conditions, degrading to approximately 90 meters under GPS denied or heavily jammed environments. Against a target the size of an amphibious assault ship, approximately 250 meters in length and 42 meters in beam, even the degraded accuracy figure produces hit probabilities per missile in a non-defended environment approaching 95%. The terminal velocity characteristic of the Tayfun is the feature that most directly explains the Aegis intercept failure at Hormuz. The missile's terminal phase velocity, achieved through a depressed trajectory option that Iranian launch crews had been trained to employ against naval targets, produces intercept window durations that are at the absolute edge of standard missile engagement feasibility. The Standard Missile 3 Block 2IA, the most capable interceptor in the American naval inventory, requires an engagement window of approximately 8 to 12 seconds for a reliable intercept solution against a Mach 3 plus terminal phase target. The Tayfun's depressed trajectory option compresses that window to between 4 and 7 seconds under standard fleet defensive geometry. 4 to 7 seconds is not sufficient for reliable engagement when the battle management system is simultaneously processing 100 incoming tracks on multiple approach vectors. The mathematics of the engagement are not a design failure of the Aegis system. They are a fundamental constraint imposed by physics and by an adversary that studied those constraints with precision and built its operational plan around exploiting them. Now the acquisition story. because this is where the strategic significance of Hormuz extends far beyond the Persian Gulf. The Tayfun's transfer to Iranian custody did not happen through a single transaction. It happened through a layered acquisition architecture that exploited three separate vulnerabilities simultaneously. The first was commercial Iranian procurement entities operating through Turkish-registered intermediary companies that maintained clean audit trails under Turkish export control regulations. The second was technical, not the transfer of complete missile systems, which would have been detectable, but the transfer of component manufacturing data and production tooling that allowed Iranian facilities to domestically produce Tayfun specification warhead sections and guidance packages. The third was political, the exploitation of the complex and deteriorating relationship between Turkey and its NATO partners to create spaces in which Turkish defense industry oversight was less rigorous than alliance security protocols required. The result was an 18-month acquisition process that American intelligence did not detect until it was complete. By the time the first intelligence indicators of Tayfun specification components in Iranian missile facilities reached analytical desks in Langley, Iranian production lines had been running for 4 months. The assessment that reached senior policymakers that Iran had acquired Tayfun technology and was producing heavy warhead variants arrived too late to change the defensive posture of the forces already positioned at Hormuz. The implications of this acquisition pathway extend well beyond Iran. It demonstrates that technology transfer restrictions and export control regimes, the primary instruments through which Western powers have attempted to limit adversary missile capability development, are more porous than official assessments acknowledge. The Tayfun acquisition was not a unique exploit of a unique vulnerability. It was a systematic exploitation of structural weaknesses in alliance-level export control architecture that exist across multiple technology domains and multiple potential adversary acquisition pipelines. The American response to September 3rd unfolded with a disorganization that was itself a strategic data point of enormous significance. On the military track, the immediate operational picture was defined by an absence of options that had not existed in April. After the destroyer losses, the United States had conducted an extensive post-engagement review, revised theater-wide Aegis coordination protocols, and deployed additional interceptor-equipped vessels. The assessment delivered to Congressional oversight committees in July was explicit. The upgraded posture was sufficient to deter further Iranian strikes. That assessment was wrong, and the analysts whose threat models had incorporated Iranian Tayfun acquisition had been unable to move their findings through a bureaucratic review process institutionally resistant to conclusions that undermined the credibility of the July reassurance to Congress. The three military options presented to the National Security Council were structurally identical to April's, with one critical difference. In April, the United States still possessed sufficient regional force posture to credibly threaten escalatory response. In September, the loss of 7 assault ships had reduced American regional combat power to a level where sustained offensive operations against Iranian territory required reinforcement timelines measured in weeks, not days. Iran knew this, American planners knew this. That shared knowledge was operationally decisive. A comprehensive air campaign now required honest acknowledgement that pre-strike force generation would take 3 to 4 weeks, during which Iran held complete freedom of action in the Gulf. A limited punitive strike faced the same structural problem it had faced in April, compounded by the reality that a second round of limited punishment following a second devastating defeat would communicate not resolve but impotence. Option 3, diplomatic pause, was adopted. Again, the political track was significantly more chaotic than April. In April, the shock had been concentrated in the defense and foreign policy establishment. By September, the American public understood that the United States Navy had suffered 2 catastrophic defeats in the same theater in the same year. The pressure on congressional leadership was not coming from a small community of defense specialists. It was coming from everywhere. The Senate Armed Services Committee convened within 8 hours. The hearing was unlike anything seen in that chamber in living memory. Then came the question that stopped the room. When had the intelligence community learned of Iranian Tayfun acquisition? The Director of National Intelligence's answer confirmed intelligence had arrived approximately 6 weeks before the strike produced a silence lasting nearly 30 seconds. 6 weeks. The United States had known 6 weeks before September 3rd that Iran possessed a weapon capable of defeating the defensive architecture of the force positioned at Hormuz. The force had not been repositioned. The posture had not been revised. The assault ships had remained in place. The question of why, how an intelligence finding of that significance failed to produce an operational response in the weeks available will occupy investigators and historians for years. The preliminary answer points to institutional inertia, bureaucratic incentives against delivering unwelcome reassessments, and a command culture with a systematic bias toward operational continuity over threat-driven posture. Revision. On the diplomatic track, Iranian back-channel communications carried a different tone than April. De-escalation willingness remained, but the specific terms Iran was prepared to accept in September were materially different from March. Two demonstrations of capability had permanently altered Tehran's assessment of its negotiating leverage, and Iran was not subtle about expressing that assessment through every available channel. There is a pattern in modern conflict that recurs with a regularity that should by now have produced fundamental change in American strategic doctrine. It has not. And understanding why it has not is as important as understanding the pattern itself. The pattern is this: a technologically superior power, assuming that material dominance translates automatically into strategic dominance, encounters an adversary whose commitment to its objectives exceeds the dominant power's tolerance, for the costs of opposing them. The superior power wins almost every tactical engagement. It imposes enormous material costs, and it still loses because losing in the sense that actually matters means reaching the point where the domestic political cost of continuing exceeds the will to continue. That point arrives for democratic powers facing committed adversaries faster than capability analysis ever predicts. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Iraq, each contains the same structural signature. Each post-conflict analysis identified specific tactical and operational failures and systematically underweighted the will dimension that was in each case the decisive variable. Iran studied every one of those analyses. With the attention of a strategic culture that has been in continuous confrontation with external powers for 45 years and has developed through sustained pressure a precise understanding of how powerful adversaries defeat themselves. The will calculus Iranian leadership applied to September 3rd rested on three assessments developed through years of careful observation. First, American political tolerance for naval casualties is lower than its tolerance for ground combat losses. Ships are national symbols in a way that forward operating bases are not. Their loss produces a political reaction that is faster, louder, and harder for any administration to manage. April had confirmed this. The Congressional reaction to 13 destroyers had been more politically destabilizing than equivalent ground campaign losses had ever produced. Second, two catastrophic defeats in the same theater in 5 months create a qualitatively different political dynamic than a single defeat. One devastating loss can be framed as a tragic exception, an intelligence failure, a systems gap, a problem addressable through targeted remediation. Two losses cannot be framed as an exception. They can only be framed as a pattern, and a pattern of defeat at the hands of a regional power playing out before a domestic public and a global audience is politically unsurvivable for any administration, regardless of its institutional willingness to absorb strategic cost. Third, the window between a second major defeat and the American political system's reconstitution of coherent strategic will is a window of maximum Iranian negotiating leverage, a window during which terms otherwise politically impossible for American leadership to accept become politically necessary. Iranian diplomatic channels engaged within hours of September 3rd, not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a precise exploitation of that window's opening. This is strategic while operating at its most sophisticated level, not the blunt endurance of a force absorbing punishment until the other side quits. A precision instrument calibrated to specific vulnerabilities in an adversary's political architecture deployed at the exact moment of maximum effect. The American strategic community must confront with honesty that its institutional culture makes genuinely difficult whether its existing assumptions about adversary resolve and deterrence credibility are adequate to the environment. Hormuz has twice revealed. The honest answer, visible in two catastrophic defeats in 5 months, is that they are not. Will is the variable that capability analysis consistently underweights. At Hormuz in September 2026, it was the variable that decided everything. The consequences of September 3rd radiate outward from the Persian Gulf in every direction simultaneously. Let us trace the most significant vectors, because each one reshapes a different dimension of the world order. The economic impact arrived before the battle damage assessments were complete. Brent crude moved from $94 at market close on September 2nd to $211 within 72 hours a move, with no precedent in the history of oil markets. Algorithmic trading systems calibrated to historical volatility ranges that made September 3rd a complete outlier, amplified the spike faster than any human intervention could moderate. Transportation costs, manufacturing inputs, food production, every supply chain with an oil dependency began moving simultaneously. Central banks that had spent 2 years managing post-pandemic inflation found themselves facing a supply shock their policy toolkits were not designed to address. The dollar's reserve currency status came under its most sustained pressure since Bretton Woods collapsed in 1971. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait jointly announced an expanded yuan-denominated oil pricing pilot within 2 weeks of the strike. The timing was not coincidental. Those frameworks had been prepared for months. September 3rd was the political permission structure that allowed their public launch. The Turkish dimension is the most consequential and least analyzed aspect of the aftermath. NATO's internal response to confirmed Tayfun technology transfer was not public condemnation, it was immediate private crisis. The alliance's internal communications in the 72 hours following the strike reveal a level of mutual recrimination with no precedent in NATO's post-Cold War history. Washington's private position was unambiguous. Turkish export control failures had directly enabled the deaths of thousands of American service members. Ankara's private position was equally direct. Iranian intermediaries had exploited commercial obfuscation layers that no export control regime anywhere had consistently defeated. The gap between those positions and NATO's absence of any institutional mechanism for resolving disputes of this character produced an alliance cohesion crisis that the strike revealed but did not create. The strains were pre-existing. September 3rd simply removed the diplomatic insulation, keeping them from rupturing publicly. China's response was widely misread. Beijing is not a simple beneficiary of American humiliation. It is a major consumer of Gulf oil and a major user of Gulf shipping lanes. China's actual response strategic reserve releases to stabilize oil markets, accelerated Gulf state diplomatic engagement, conspicuously neutral public messaging, reflected interests far more nuanced than the beneficiary narrative. Captures. What China extracted from September 3rd was not satisfaction. It was operational data. The successful saturation defeat of Aegis naval defense, demonstrated twice in 5 months with different missile systems, has direct implications for every theater where Chinese and American strategic interests compete. Beijing did not need to fire a missile to absorb that lesson. Russia drew primarily doctrinal conclusions. Wave sequencing approach, vector diversification, intercept cycle, exploitation, these techniques confirmed and extended by September 3rd are being incorporated into Russian operational planning for Baltic and Black Sea naval scenarios. That incorporation is not a future possibility, it is a current process. The broadest implication belongs to every navy on Earth. September 3rd has raised fundamental questions about surface vessel survivability against saturation missile attack in contested littoral environments. Questions that apply to aircraft carriers as directly as they apply to amphibious assault ships. Those questions are being asked in naval ministries, from Beijing to London to New Delhi. The answers will reshape ship design, force structure, and operational doctrine for the next 30 years. The world that existed on September 2nd no longer exists. The world that replaced it is less predictable, more multipolar, and significantly more dangerous. Understanding it clearly is no longer optional. I want to close this episode where every honest analysis of conflict must eventually arrive at the human reality underneath the strategic abstraction. The 7 ships destroyed on September 3rd, 2026 were not strategic variables in an academic war game. They were communities. Each amphibious assault ship carries between 3,000 and 4,000 sailors and Marines, men and women who had trained together, served together, built the kind of bonds that sustained military service produces. The losses of September 3rd represent not just a strategic defeat, but a human catastrophe of a scale that the United States military had not experienced since the Second World War. That human reality should not be sanitized by strategic analysis. It should inform it. Because the systemic failures that produced those losses, the intelligence failure that did not elevate the Tayfun acquisition warning in time, the command culture failure that did not revise the force posture when the warning arrived, the strategic planning failure that positioned forces of that significance in a threat environment that had already demonstrated its capacity for catastrophic offensive action, those failures had human consequences. Real ones. The accountability for those failures when it arrives should be proportional to their weight. The strategic reckoning that Hormuz demands is not comfortable. It requires American strategic culture to confront conclusions about the limits of material dominance, the importance of adversary will, the porosity of technology transfer restrictions, and the gap between deterrence rhetoric and deterrence reality that the institutional incentives of the national security establishment have consistently pushed toward the margins of official discourse. That reckoning is not optional. The alternative, treating September 3rd as another isolated failure to be addressed through targeted remediation, while the structural assumptions that produced it remain intact, is the path to a third catastrophe in a third theater against the same adversary, or a different one that has been watching and learning. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. It has now swallowed American naval power twice in 5 months. It will not give back what it has taken. But it has given something in return, a clarity about strategic reality that, if the institutions responsible for American security are willing to look at it honestly, is more valuable than anything it destroyed. Whether they are willing to look honestly is the question that the next chapter of this story will answer. This is Professor Jiang Xueqin. This has been the Jiang Report. If this analysis reached you, if it gave you something you cannot find in the mainstream coverage, subscribe now. Share this episode. The follow-up examining the Turkish NATO crisis in full detail is in production, and it will go further than anything this channel has published. You do not want to miss it. Until then, stay analytical, stay rigorous, and stay with the Jiang Report.